I never imagined my past would come back to haunt me like this. When I met Michael, it felt like everything in my life finally clicked into place. He was kind, steady, and completely devoted to me, in a way no one had ever been before. We dated for 2 years before tying the knot, and for the first year of our marriage, I thought we were unshakable. But then came the barbecue. Michael had invited a group of his closest friends over to our house for a casual weekend get-together. It wasn't the first time I'd met them. His tight-knit group included Jason, Tom, and Louis, all of whom I'd seen at parties or gatherings before. But I'd always kept my distance, exchanging polite hellos and avoiding lingering conversations. That day, as the guys stood around the grill laughing and reminiscing, Jason turned to Michael with a sly grin. "Man, you really got lucky with Hannah," he said, his voice just loud enough for me to hear. Michael laughed, flipping a burger. "Don't I know it?" Jason chuckled, but there was something in his tone that made my stomach tighten. "Yeah, some of us had to learn that the hard way." I froze, my drink halfway to my lips. The room seemed to go quiet, though I knew the conversation around us continued. I glanced at Jason, hoping he'd leave it at that, but the knowing look he gave me made my heart race. Michael frowned, looking between us. "What's that supposed to mean?" he asked, his voice light but edged with curiosity. Jason waved a hand dismissively. "Nothing, man. Just saying she's a catch." Michael seemed to accept the answer, but I knew better. I could feel his eyes on me, could sense the unspoken questions swirling in his mind. The rest of the day passed uneventfully, or so it seemed. Michael didn't bring it up again, but his mood shifted. He was quieter, more withdrawn, and I caught him glancing at me with an expression I couldn't quite place. That night, as we lay in bed, he finally spoke. "What did Jason mean earlier?" he asked, his voice low but firm. I hesitated, my heart pounding. "I'm not sure," I said carefully. "He's probably just joking around. You know how Jason is." Michael didn't respond immediately. "Do you know him from somewhere?" The question hung in the air, heavy with implication. I could feel the weight of the truth pressing down on me, but I couldn't bring myself to say it. "No," I lied, turning onto my side to avoid his gaze. Michael didn't push further, but the tension between us lingered. The truth was, I did know Jason, and Tom, and Louis. Years before I met Michael, I'd had brief, casual relationships with all 3 of them at different times. None of them had seemed particularly significant back then, just fleeting moments in my life before I met the man I wanted to build a future with. When I realized they were his friends, it was like the ground shifted beneath me. I wanted to tell him, but I didn't know how. How do you explain something like that without sounding like a terrible person? So I chose silence, convincing myself it didn't matter. It was the past, after all. But Jason's comment changed everything. Over the next week, Michael grew increasingly distant. He was still kind, still polite, but there was a wall between us that hadn't been there before. He'd come home from work and barely speak, burying himself in his phone or heading to bed early. I tried to act like everything was fine, but the knot in my stomach grew tighter with each passing day. I knew he was putting the pieces together, even if he hadn't said it outright. Then, one evening, I walked into the living room to find him sitting on the couch, staring at his phone with a look of quiet devastation. "What's wrong?" I asked, my voice trembling. He looked up at me, his jaw tight. "I talked to Tom today," he said, his voice cold. The blood drained from my face. "Oh." "He told me everything," Michael continued, his tone sharp. "About you, about Jason, about Louis. He thought I already knew." I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came out. Michael stood, his expression filled with hurt and anger. "How could you not tell me, Hannah? How could you let me be friends with them, spend time with them, while you kept this from me?" "I didn't know how," I said weakly, tears spilling down my cheeks. It was before you, Michael. It didn't mean anything. But it means something to me, he snapped, his voice breaking. You let me build my life with you, never telling me the truth, knowing it would come out eventually. Did you think I'd just never find out? I thought it didn't matter, I whispered. Well, it does, he said, his voice quieter but no less firm. It matters because now I can't look at my friends, or you, the same way. Every time I think about it, all I feel is humiliation. How am I supposed to move past that? I reached for him, desperate to fix the damage I'd caused, but he stepped back. I need space, he said, his voice cold. I don't know if I can do this anymore, Hannah. As he walked out of the room, I collapsed onto the couch, sobbing. My past, the choices I thought I'd left behind, had finally caught up with me. And now, I wasn't sure if my marriage could survive it. The tension in our house was unbearable after that night. Michael had retreated into himself, speaking to me only when necessary. He was polite, but distant, his warmth replaced by an icy detachment that made my chest ache. Every attempt I made to bridge the gap between us only seemed to push him further away. I tried to convince myself that it was just a matter of time. He'd calm down eventually, wouldn't he? After all, the relationships with his friends had happened long before we met. They were meaningless flings, moments that didn't even come close to comparing to what Michael and I had built together. Surely he'd see that. But Michael wasn't seeing it that way. He'd started coming home later from work, spending hours in his office when he did return. Sometimes I'd hear the low murmur of his voice on the phone, though he never mentioned who he was talking to. At night, he lay beside me in bed but felt miles away. One evening, as I was making dinner, I decided to try again. Michael, I said softly, setting 2 plates on the table. Can we please talk about this? I hate the way things have been between us. He looked up from his phone, his jaw tightening. Talk about what, Hannah? The fact that you lied to me for years? That every time I've hung out with my friends, I've been the only one who didn't know about your history with them? It wasn't like that, I said quickly, sitting down across from him. I didn't lie, I just didn't know how to bring it up. His expression darkened. Not telling me is the same as lying, Hannah. You had plenty of chances to say something, but you chose not to. You let me befriend them, trust them, without telling me the truth. I reached for his hand, but he pulled away, the hurt in his eyes cutting me deeply. It was before you, I pleaded. It didn't mean anything. I didn't even know they were your friends until after we got together. That doesn't make it better, he snapped, his voice rising. Do you know how humiliating this is for me? To think that the people I've called my closest friends were laughing behind my back? To know that they knew things about you that I didn't? They weren't laughing at you, I said, though even as the words left my mouth, they felt hollow. Michael let out a bitter laugh. You don't know that. And honestly, it doesn't matter. What matters is that I feel like I can't trust you, Hannah. I thought our marriage was built on honesty, but now I don't know what to believe. His words hit me like a punch to the gut. I love you, I whispered, tears welling up in my eyes. I've always loved you. Please, Michael, don't let this ruin us. He shook his head, his voice quieter but no less firm. It's not just about love, Hannah. It's about respect. And right now, I don't feel like you've shown me any. The breaking point came a few days later. Michael had left his laptop open on the kitchen counter while he ran out to grab something from the store. As I passed by, the screen lit up with a notification from Tom. Do you think Hannah told him everything? My stomach dropped. Without thinking, I clicked on the message and the chat thread opened before me. The messages between Michael and Tom were damning. Tom. We agreed we wouldn't talk about it, but Jason slipped up. I didn't know what to say when Michael asked me. Hannah. I panicked, okay? I didn't know how to handle it. I told you guys this couldn't come out. I scrolled further, my hands shaking as I read their attempts to manage the fallout. They'd been discussing me behind Michael's back, trying to cover for me while also throwing me under the bus. When Michael came home, I was waiting for him, the laptop still open on the counter. "What's this?" I asked, my voice trembling. He froze, his eyes flicking to the screen. His expression shifted from confusion to realization, and then to something darker. "You went through my messages?" "Don't turn this around on me," I shot back, my anger fueled by the rising panic in my chest. "What is this, Michael? Why are you talking to them about me like this?" "Because I needed the truth," he said flatly, closing the door behind him. "Something you weren't willing to give me." I felt the tears start to fall as I stepped closer. "I was trying to protect you," I said desperately. "I didn't want to hurt you." "Hurt me," he repeated, his voice rising. "You've been hurting me every day since this came out, Hannah. Do you know what it's like to feel like the last person to know the truth about your own wife? To wonder if the people you trust are laughing at you behind your back?" "They're not," I insisted, though I wasn't sure I believed it anymore. Michael shook his head, his expression filled with a mix of anger and sadness. "It doesn't matter. What matters is that you lied to me. You hid this from me, and now I don't know if I can ever trust you again." I reached for him, but he stepped back, his voice breaking as he spoke. "I've already made my decision, Hannah. I'm filing for divorce." The words hit me like a sledgehammer. "No," I whispered, shaking my head. "Michael, please, don't do this. We can fix this. I'll do whatever it takes." But his eyes were resolute. "It's too late," he said quietly. "You've already broken us." He walked away, leaving me standing in the kitchen, shattered. The sound of the door closing behind him felt like the final nail in the coffin of our marriage. As I sank to the floor, the weight of my choices crashing down on me, I realized there was no undoing what had been done. Michael was gone, and the life we'd built together was in ruins. When Michael came home that night, I could tell something was different. He walked into the house without the usual tension he'd carried in the past weeks, but instead of relief, the calmness in his demeanor sent a shiver down my spine. He wasn't angry, not in the way he had been before. He looked resolved. "Michael," I started, standing up from the couch where I'd been waiting for him. "We need to talk." "You're right," he said, setting his bag down on the counter. "We do." I hesitated, thrown off by his calm tone. "Okay," I said carefully. He walked into the living room and sat down across from me, his eyes locking onto mine. "I want you to tell me the truth, Hannah," he said, his voice steady but sharp. "No more deflecting, no more minimizing. I want to hear it all, right now. Did you sleep with Jason, Tom, and Lewis?" My heart sank. Hearing their names spoken out loud, all together like that, made it impossible to deny what had happened. There was no escaping this now. "Yes," I whispered, my voice barely audible. Michael's expression didn't change, but I saw the flicker of pain in his eyes. "When?" he demanded. "Before I met you," I said quickly, desperate to explain. "It was before we were together, Michael. I didn't even know they were your friends back then." "And yet you didn't think it was important enough to tell me when you found out?" he asked, his tone growing sharper. "I didn't know how," I said, tears welling up in my eyes. "I didn't want to hurt you. It didn't mean anything." "They didn't mean anything." "But it means something to me, Hannah," he snapped, his voice finally breaking through the calm facade. "It means everything to me. You let me spend years building friendships with those men, trusting them, not knowing what you all shared behind my back." "It wasn't like that," I insisted, the tears streaming down my face now. "I never meant for this to happen. I didn't think it mattered." Michael let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. "You didn't think it mattered?" he repeated. "Do you know how humiliating this is for me? To find out that my wife had been with not one, but 3 of my closest friends? That they knew things about you, about your past, that I didn't? I reached out for him, but he leaned back, putting distance between us. I thought I knew you, he said, his voice quieter now, but no less cutting. I thought we had something real, built on honesty and trust. But how can I trust someone who hides something like this? I was scared, I admitted, my voice trembling. I was scared of how you'd react, of losing you. Well, congratulations, he said bitterly. You achieved the opposite. His words cut deep, but I couldn't blame him. I had made mistake after mistake, and now it was all crashing down around me. Michael, I said, my voice pleading, please don't let this ruin us. I love you. I've always loved you. This was before us, before I even knew you existed. You can't let the past destroy what we have now. What we have now, he repeated, his voice cold. What exactly do we have, Hannah? Because right now, all I feel is anger and betrayal. Every time I think about them, about you, I feel sick. How am I supposed to move past that? How am I supposed to look at you and not see them? His words left me speechless, the weight of his pain settling over me like a crushing force. I need you to understand something, he continued, his voice steady again. This isn't just about the past. It's about the fact that you hid it from me. You let me be in the dark, thinking we were solid, while you carried this secret. That's what hurts the most, Hannah. Not just what you did, but what you didn't tell me. I was trying to protect you, I said weakly. No, he said firmly, cutting me off. You were trying to protect yourself. The silence that followed was deafening. I could feel the finality of his words, the wall he had built between us. What are you saying? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. He looked at me, his expression filled with a sadness that took my breath away. I'm saying I can't do this anymore. I can't be in a marriage where I feel like the last person to know the truth, where I'm constantly wondering what else you've hidden from me. I can't live like this, Hannah. No, I said, shaking my head. Michael, please, we can fix this. We can go to therapy, we can— It's too late, he said, standing up. I've already made my decision. I'm filing for divorce. His words hit me like a sledgehammer. I stood there, frozen, as he picked up his bag and walked toward the door. As he opened it, he paused and turned back to me. I loved you, Hannah, but love isn't enough when trust is gone. And then he was gone, leaving me alone in the empty house, the silence around me echoing the finality of what had just happened. I sank onto the couch, the weight of his words crushing me. This wasn't just a fight or a rough patch we'd work through. This was the end. And no matter how much I wanted to undo the damage I'd caused, it was too late. I had lost him, not because he stopped loving me, but because I had failed to protect the trust that held us together. The day Michael left was the beginning of a silence I'd never known before. He didn't yell, didn't slam the door. He just packed a bag and walked out, leaving me with an emptiness that felt louder than any argument we'd ever had. I sat on the couch for hours after he was gone, staring at the door and hoping he'd come back. But deep down, I knew he wouldn't. A week later, I found out he'd rented an apartment across town. He didn't tell me directly. Instead, a mutual friend mentioned it in passing. He said he needed space, they explained. He's cutting ties with, well, pretty much everyone. By everyone, they meant Jason, Tom, and Louis. It shouldn't have surprised me. Michael was the type to make clean breaks. From what I heard, he'd stopped responding to their messages and unfollowed them on social media. They were no longer part of his inner circle, and neither was I. The realization hurt more than I expected. I had always thought of our marriage as unshakable, something built on love and understanding. But trust was the foundation of that love, and once it was gone, everything else crumbled with it. Michael didn't just leave me. He left the life we'd built together. He threw himself into work, taking on more projects and climbing the corporate ladder faster than ever. People told me he looked good. healthier, more focused. Seeing pictures of him at networking events or smiling with new friends was bittersweet. I was happy he was doing well, but it hurt to see him thriving without me. Meanwhile, my life felt like it was stuck in limbo. The house we'd shared was too big, too quiet, and filled with reminders of what I'd lost. His coffee mug still sat on the counter where he'd left it, and the sight of his empty side of the closet made my chest ache. I tried to keep busy, throwing myself into work and reaching out to friends, but the guilt was always there, lurking just beneath the surface. It wasn't just about the past. It was about the choices I'd made after we got married. I should have told him the truth the moment I realized who Jason, Tom, and Louis were. I should have faced the discomfort instead of hiding behind silence and hoping it would never come up. But I hadn't, and now I was paying the price. The nights were the hardest. I'd lie awake in bed, staring at the ceiling and replaying every argument, every moment where I could have done something differently. The weight of my mistakes felt suffocating, and the loneliness was a constant reminder of how much I'd taken Michael for granted. I started therapy a month after he left. It wasn't easy, but I knew I had to confront the choices that had brought me to this point. My therapist helped me unpack the guilt, the fear of judgment that had kept me silent, and the ways I'd failed to prioritize honesty in my marriage. Through the sessions, I began to understand that my actions hadn't just hurt Michael. They had hurt me too. By avoiding the truth, I'd built a marriage on a shaky foundation, one that couldn't withstand the weight of my past. Despite the progress I was making, the emptiness remained. I missed Michael every day. His laugh, his steady presence, the way he made me feel safe. I reached out to him a few times, sending long messages apologizing and begging for another chance. But his responses, when they came, were short and distant. "I've moved on," he wrote once. "I hope you can too." That message broke me in a way nothing else had. It was the final confirmation that our marriage was over, that the life we'd built together was gone. Michael filed for divorce a few months later. The process was quick and civil. He didn't want to fight, just to move on. Signing the papers felt like closing the door on a part of myself, but I knew it was the only way forward for both of us. As painful as it was, the divorce forced me to face the reality of what I'd done. I had let my fear and pride dictate my actions, and in doing so, I had destroyed the trust that held us together. Michael's life seemed to flourish after the divorce. He moved to a new city, started traveling more, and even adopted a dog, a golden retriever he named Max. Friends told me he seemed happier, freer. It was bittersweet to hear, knowing I'd never be part of that new chapter. For me, the journey was slower, more painful. The guilt and loneliness didn't disappear overnight, but therapy helped me find a path forward. I began focusing on rebuilding my life, setting new goals, and learning how to be honest, with myself and with others. The hardest lesson was accepting that some mistakes can't be undone. Love, no matter how strong, isn't enough without trust and honesty. I had learned that too late, and it had cost me everything. Now, when I look back on my marriage to Michael, I see it as both a blessing and a cautionary tale. He taught me what it meant to love and be loved, but he also taught me the importance of protecting that love through honesty and respect. I'll carry those lessons with me for the rest of my life, even as I try to move forward without him. When the divorce papers arrived, it felt like the last piece of my world had crumbled. Michael's name was there, bold and decisive, on the documents that would officially end our marriage. I stared at them for what felt like hours, my hands trembling as I held the pages. I'd known this moment was coming. He had told me as much. But knowing and seeing it in writing were two entirely different things. There were no dramatic gestures, no final pleas to reconsider. Michael had made his decision, and he wasn't looking back. His lawyer was professional and efficient, ensuring the process would be as quick and clean as possible. I signed the papers through tears, knowing there was no point in fighting. Michael and I exchanged only a handful of words in the weeks that followed. When he came to the house to pick up his things, he was polite, but distant, his demeanor carefully composed. He packed his belongings methodically, taking only what he needed and leaving the rest behind. "I'll send someone for the furniture later," he said as he loaded the last box into his car. I stood in the doorway, clutching the frame for support, wanting to say something, anything, that might make him pause. But the words wouldn't come. I knew that no apology, no explanation could undo the damage I'd caused. As he turned to leave, he hesitated for just a moment. "Take care of yourself, Hannah," he said softly, before getting into his car and driving away. Those words stayed with me long after he was gone. There was no anger in his voice, no bitterness, just the quiet resignation of someone who had accepted that the life we'd built was over. In the months that followed, I watched from afar as Michael rebuilt his life. He left the city and moved to a smaller town, where he took a new job and surrounded himself with people who didn't remind him of the past. He cut ties with Jason, Tom, and Louis completely, severing any connection to the circle of betrayal he felt trapped in. Friends told me he was thriving, happier, more confident, and finally at peace. Seeing photos of him smiling with new friends or hiking in the mountains was bittersweet. I was glad he was finding happiness, but it hurt to know I was no longer part of that picture. For me, life after Michael felt like wading through a fog. The house we'd shared became a constant reminder of what I'd lost, and every room echoed with memories of him. His favorite coffee mug sat untouched in the cupboard, and I couldn't bring myself to change the way his side of the bed remained perfectly made. I spent countless nights replaying everything in my mind, wondering where it had all gone wrong. The answer was always the same. It wasn't just one night or one mistake. It was the culmination of choices I'd made, the lies I'd told myself, and the truths I'd hidden from him. The past had a way of catching up, and in my case, it had destroyed the trust that held our marriage together. The hardest part was accepting that Michael had truly moved on. When the divorce was finalized, it felt like the last thread connecting us had been severed. I no longer had any reason to call him, no hope that we might somehow reconcile. Over time, I began to see the lessons in my mistakes. I realized how much damage secrets can do, especially when they touch the closest parts of your life. I had thought that my past didn't matter, that it wouldn't affect my future, but I was wrong. Keeping those parts of myself hidden from Michael had created a rift I couldn't repair, no matter how much I wanted to. The guilt stayed with me, but I learned to carry it without letting it consume me. Therapy helped me unpack the fears and insecurities that had driven my choices, and I began to understand how to be honest, not just with others, but with myself. Still, there are nights when I lie awake and think about Michael, about what we had and what we lost. I wonder if he ever thinks of me, if he remembers the good times we shared, or if the pain of our ending has overshadowed everything else. But I know that wondering won't change anything. Michael is gone, and the life we built together is over. All I can do now is take the lessons I've learned and try to be better, to live a life that honors the love we once had, even if it's no longer mine to hold. Secrets, especially those tied to people closest to us, can erode trust in ways we don't always see until it's too late. They have the power to turn love into doubt and connection into betrayal. Trust is fragile, and once it's broken, rebuilding it is often impossible. For Michael and me, the damage was irreversible, leaving us both to pick up the pieces and move forward on separate paths.